So I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor for the past month to be able to test different types of foods and how these foods or drinks affect our blood sugar levels in real time. So I cannot wait to share with y'all. Some are to be expected, others are really surprising. So from things like fried chicken to sourdough bread to different types of chocolates, cannot wait to share the results with y'all.
Yay Networks.
A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. All right, so we have talked about continuous glucose monitors on this podcast before. So I'll link to two full episodes that we've done on it, really diving into what these devices are, how they're useful. The brand that I've used a lot and I love is Nutrisense. And Nutrisense sponsored this podcast a while back, and it's in 2022. That was my first experience, my first exposure to the brand. And it really educated me a lot on things that, even as a dietitian for more than 2 decades, things that I would have thought were a certain way, or assumptions that we made, that we assumed to be true in terms of athletes or performance fueling or what's going to be best for our bodies before intense workouts. Those things that as a sports dietitian, we sort of say, well, this is the case. This is what's going to be best. I found that first round that I wore the glucose monitor last year, there was a lot of surprises. And so I'll cover a little bit of those in this episode, but if you want to hear even more, go back. I'll link to it in the episode notes. But things like, for example, before a really intense workout, kind of a high intensity cardio workout, I would specifically and purposefully include a source of carbohydrates. And primarily carbohydrates, as we would say for an athlete, primarily carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat. And what I found is that my blood sugar levels were plummeting. And while that's kind of what we would think would be the wise thing to eat before, and what might seem counterintuitive is to go low carb before that, when I switched to a lower carb almond flour tortilla with just full fat provolone cheese, so low carb, more protein, more fat, it actually had a really stabilizing effect, kept glucose levels stable, didn't spike too high, didn't drop too low, and I felt so much better during those intense workouts. So that's just kind of like one example, but I cover a lot of really my first experience with it. And here's kind of a little bit of why it matters also. When we look at glucose levels being high, our blood sugar levels being high, that's just a natural course of what happens after we eat. Just many types of foods, I should say. There's fasting glucose levels you want to have, in a controlled lower range, but it's a normal thing after a meal or snack for our blood sugar levels to go up. The thing is that we want to have them go up, but not too high. And again, the levels of normal vary by individual. So I don't really want to get into that so much, but just know that, yeah, it's normal. You're gonna have your fasting levels. It's normal for our glucose levels to go up after we eat, but we want to look at kind of buffering how high those glucose levels are spiking, and also making sure that they don't stay high, that those glucose levels aren't just staying high and elevated for hours after we eat. When our glucose levels are high, that is one of the conditions that is pro-inflammatory in our bodies. So it leads to inflammation. And when you look at things like joint pain or things like cardiovascular disease, all of these things are linked to inflammation. When we look at those high glucose levels, not only is it linked to specifically inflammation, but also vascular damage. It damages the lining of our vessels. So there's a whole host of issues when we look at high glucose levels. Also, if you look at someone who their goal is to lose body fat, when we have these continually high circulating glucose levels, our body is continually pumping out insulin to try to bring down these glucose levels. when we're in that state, our bodies are going to be more prone to store body fat or continue to store body fat, less likely to use that stored fat as a source of fuel. So when glucose levels are high, insulin levels are high, our bodies are in a storage mode, not able to as effectively use that body fat as it or fats as an energy source. So there's a lot of reasons we want to try to keep glucose levels controlled. Also, when we do have that roller coaster of glucose levels, that's where the roller coaster of energy and mood and cravings can happen. So all of these things are sort of like why it matters and why it's so interesting to think about or to be aware of how different foods may affect those glucose levels. So I want to first jump right into some of the foods that I was testing specifically. So I had gotten Brad a continuous glucose monitor for Christmas, and I know you're like, seriously, but we don't do big gifts. So that was the main gift that I got him. But he had, in fairness, he had seen last year, he had seen me wear it. He had seen the different kind of responses I had and the knowledge and the more information that I had about how foods are affecting me personally. And he had that curiosity about it. And we don't really do gifts. And so that was sort of like the main gift that I got him. And it was each sensor lasts for 2 weeks. And so I had gotten him a month of that. And he wore his for 2 weeks and he didn't want to, he got what he needed from that. He understood it wasn't something he was going to continue with. And so I had that extra sensor plus another, and this is the NutriSense brand. So I'll tell y'all more about that at the end. And then I'm also want to tell y'all, so the NutriSense is what we've talked about before, but there's also what I've just become aware of. There is the actual sensor is called Freestyle Libre. It's by Abbott. And that is also available at a really reduced price. A little bit more of a bare bones approach. It doesn't have all the app and all the other bells and whistles that accompany the NutriSense. But I want to save that to the end. So if you're interested in that, listen to the end. I'm going to tell you kind of like all the details that I've learned because it gets a little bit technical in there, but I'll share that at the end. We'll get to the fun stuff first of the foods that I was testing. So for starters, I was looking at testing several different chocolates specifically. And there was 3 that I was looking at, or chocolate kind of finds. One is Lily's chocolate. And Lily's has a lot of different varieties. There's milk chocolate, dark chocolate, there's caramel chocolate, there's peanut butter filled chocolate. But the common thread with all of the Lily's chocolates is that they are essentially no sugar, no carb, less than 1 gram of sugar. They're stevia sweetened. The meltability of them, the quality, they're to me a really good option, a good alternative that's still really satisfying for chocolate. Yet with the plant-based sweetener, with stevia, they're very, very low sugar. So that was one that I was really interested in testing. And I'm happy to report that it had I had it several different times. So I did the hard work of eating the chocolate. So you're welcome. So I could report on it. But it had essentially a flatline effect. So when I'd usually have the equivalent of 100 calories or so of the Lily's chocolate, the little squares to add up to 100 calories, which is less than what it says a serving is on the bar, by the way. But, that was sort of kind of what I would be interested in having, or the size that I was looking to have. So about 100 calories worth of the Lily's would have at the most about a 5-point increase in glucose levels. So what that means is if I had not eaten for a little while and I would, scan my little sensor and I might see that I was at 90, let's just say, and then I would have the Lily's, it would bring me maybe staying at 90, 91, 92, at the most 93 to 95. So about a 3 to 5 point increase, which is really nothing to speak of for having this nice portion, this nice little, several squares of this chocolate. I personally, the ones that I did was the milk chocolate, caramel, and then also the dark chocolate filled with peanut butter. The other one that I did was Quest. And this was interesting. So there's the Quest peanut butter cups. If you haven't tried these, I was afraid that the Quest peanut butter cups would be sort of like a Quest protein bar shaped like a peanut butter cup. but they actually, the texture, the flavor of them, they're really a pretty decent, I would even go beyond saying decent. I think they're a really good alternative for a peanut butter cup. They're store bought. You can find them at places like a GNC or a Vitamin Shop. We sell them at Oshner Fitness Center, but they're basically about 100 calories for each little peanut butter cup. Almost no carbs, like 1 gram of carb per peanut butter cup. Very like no sugar, again, like less than a gram of sugar. Also plant based sweetened there. And what was interesting on that is so the Lily's chocolate, when I would have the Lily's, it would sort of just like flatline on the glucose levels, maybe going up a couple of points, not more than 5. What was interesting about the Quest peanut butter cup, and I would usually again have one. There's 2 per package, which is 200 calories. One felt like the right amount of like richness that I was looking for. So again, about 100 calories worth of this little peanut butter cup. And I found almost every time, not every time, but probably maybe if I had it the 6 times, I could scroll through my little app and see, but just going off of memory, maybe 6 times, at least 5 of those, it actually brought my glucose levels down and down significantly. Like if it was at the 90 or 100, it would bring it down 15, sometimes 20 points, which was stunning to me. And I was like, almost as if it was, and this is me saying a very anecdotal statement. This is not at all what this does, but it looked to me, it was so significant as I would have that one Quest peanut butter cup, the drop almost every time was so significant that it was as if there was something in there that was dropping the glucose levels. I know that it doesn't. It's just primarily different fats in there, but it's so much the fact that it's fats and doesn't have the carbs, and it's mostly the plant-based fats there, that it is very surprising how much it drops it. So one example that I'll give is a few nights ago, I'm kind of scrolling back through the app, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that looks like in a second. But as I had the Quest peanut butter cup, one little cup, glucose levels were at 111. It had been after dinner. So my glucose levels were a little bit up. We'd just eaten dinner. I had the one peanut butter cup, glucose levels were 111. And then let's see, it was about 30 minutes later, 83. And so I say that it's dropped them that significantly or close to it almost every time. That's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. To me, it's just much more like of an interesting thing. And that's me. That all of these that I'm going to be sharing with y'all today, of course, are just how they've affected my glucose levels. But it was really interesting that something that did have it could satisfy that sweet craving, but instead of like a normal peanut butter cup, which we would know to raise our glucose levels because of the high sugar content in a normal peanut butter cup, that this is going to not only for me personally doesn't raise my glucose levels, but in the next 30 minutes, they actually drop pretty significantly. And that happened over and over. So it was really, really surprising to me to see that response to it. I mentioned that there was 3 different chocolates I was trying. So there was the Lily's, there was the Quest peanut butter cups. The third is not so much a chocolate, but kind of like it was a little chocolate chip cookie. And this is the high key cookie. And so they're kind of like little shortbread style cookies. And this was one that I had originally experimented with last year when I first tried the sensor. And so I had several different little gluten-free cookies that I had done a segment on. And they were all relatively low carb, low sugar. And a couple of them, like a serving was like maybe 15 grams of carbs of this one particular like gluten-free brand that I just, again, not because they're gluten-free, I bought them, but I was doing a segment on them. They were lower sugar, naturally gluten-free. And I would have a couple of little cookies was a serving, 15 grams of carbs. And what I saw last year in this other brand, not the high key, but a different brand, was that when I had that as a nighttime snack, it was bringing my glucose levels into like the 140s, which is high. And it was staying there for 5, 6, 7 hours through the night. I was staying in that high or kind of that caution level. And I was, it was really surprising to me that for me, I'm that sensitive to those carbohydrates, especially at night, that it was causing it to stay high. Not only to go that high as I had it, but then to stay that high because I would have it at night before bed and then you're not moving around. You're just laying down and my body wasn't clearing those carbohydrates. It was just staying up. So last year, part of the experiment that you'll hear me talk a little bit more about, if you listen to the first one that we did on the continuous glucose monitors, is I switched to the high key cookies. And so these have, I would say, kind of an effect like that Lily's chocolate that I mentioned. They're not really dropping glucose levels, but they're also not raising it. So they're keeping it kind of that flat line or maybe up 1 or 2 points, but essentially a non effect on glucose levels. So for the chocolate items, the high key cookies, the Lily's chocolate, for me personally, kind of that flat, just a non issue on it. That Quest peanut butter cup actually, for me, is dropping those glucose levels a little bit. So if you are going to kind of experiment with some different foods, keep in mind that what you eat before also can matter. So it could matter, and I'll tell you a little bit more as we go. I'll kind of give y'all some different scenarios. But another good example is the non-alcoholic beers. So I've been kind of, playing around with some of the different non-alcoholic beers. Surreal is one that's very low calorie, like 17 calorie, 25 calorie beer. There's another brand called Partake. And then there's Heineken, and those are really low calorie, like 10, 15 calories. And then there's Heineken 00. Heineken 00 has like I don't have the bottle in front of me, but it's in like either the 70s or the 90s calories, and the carbs are about 16 grams. Not a lot of sugar, but about 16 grams of carbs in the Heineken 00. And what I found was that the Heineken 00, if I had it just that, like if we were somewhere and I hadn't eaten and I just had that almost on an empty stomach, my glucose levels would shoot up 30 points or more. Also, there was one occasion where we were out of town and we were at a restaurant, and we had some sourdough bread and a couple of other things that were kind of like more starchy, carby, with our meal. And then I also had a Heineken 00. And so my glucose levels went from about 73 to about 124. And at first I thought, gosh, I didn't have that much sourdough bread. I didn't have, I didn't think that with my meal I'd had mostly protein, I'd had some fish and vegetables. I thought that was weird that I went from, the low 70s, like 71, that it went up 50 points to like 124. I thought that didn't seem like I had that much bread. Then I realized, oh, wait, I had that Heineken 00. So realizing that not only did I have the Heineken 00, I had also paired it with some sourdough bread and another little source of, carb that we'd had with that meal. And it had really gone a lot higher. Other times I've had similar, but I've had just the protein, veg, just that fish and vegetables or plant-based fats, avocado or guacamole or whatever it is. And then when I have something like that Heineken 00, it doesn't have nearly as much of an effect because I had that protein, I had that fat, I had it after that, and I didn't have it with other starch. So knowing that if you're going to experiment with something like a continuous glucose monitor, trying foods in different scenarios, you're going to see different results. If you're eating something on a completely empty stomach, you're going to have one response to that. If you have maybe more protein or more fats that you've recently consumed, then you're probably going to have a different response from that. If you've recently exercised versus not, when we exercise, our bodies become much more adept, much more efficient at processing carbohydrates. And so if you've recently exercised, that food may not raise your glucose levels as much as if you had been sedentary. So there's a lot of different variables. And so playing around with it can kind of let you just see what that is. But so just know that if you are going in and trying something, I wouldn't do it as like a one and done. I would try it several different times and kind of see how did it affect. The one that I thought was absolutely stunning, I thought this was so surprising, was fried chicken. And y'all might be like, what? So this was a really funny conversation. And actually this conversation was sort of why I decided to do an episode on this topic in general. It was, late April, and we were doing, several different TV stations. We were talking about Eat Fit at French Quarter Fest and Jazz Fest. And so I was in one of our local TV studios that I know the folks there, but I'm not there often. I'm there maybe a couple of times a year for different interviews for things like this, like the festival season with Eat Fit. And I know them and, we'll always kind of just catch up a little bit whenever I see them. But one of the guys calls across the studio and says, so Molly, do you ever, and he used the word cheat. And if y'all listen to this podcast, I probably don't love the word cheat because it's kind of like the word should, so, but I think he asked, do you ever cheat? I mean, do you ever eat anything that's like not good for you? And I said, yeah. I was like, of course. I mean, I love, like I just mentioned, like, white bread or sourdough with butter. I mean, like those, like good sourdough bread and butter is delicious. But like, I didn't say all that to him. But the answer, of course, is yes. Every day, we may get pizza, we may get different things. And it's just, what else you're balancing it out with. But as he asked me that question, it happened to be a Monday morning. And the day before, had been the second day I had this continuous glucose monitor in. We had happened, I can't remember what the circumstances were, that, maybe a couple of times a year we'll get Popeyes, and Brad loves Popeyes fried chicken. And the reality is, like, who doesn't? I mean, it is good. And so I love like the thighs, and I'll typically do like a fried thigh. And of course, if you take the skin off, it's as lean as grilled skinless chicken. The skin, though, is delicious. And so, kind of going back to, this person's question, I had a piece of chicken just as it is, a thigh, like with the skin and everything. And then I had a second piece with every intention of taking the skin off of that, but still kind of picked at some of the skin. So I had a decent bit of the breading from the second one and then all of the breading from the first. And it was crazy when I looked at that entire day. The little line. So as you look at the NutriSense app, it puts on a graph where your glucose levels are throughout the whole day. So if you could imagine, the way that I'll typically eat, maybe protein, veg, plant-based fats, not a lot of starchy carbs, because I do find that I do better with the other. And again, that's just me personally. But as you look at it, it sort of hovers in that middle range. It doesn't go too high. It doesn't go too low. So if you could imagine just kind of a squiggly line, almost like how it looks a little bit like an EKG line, but it's not like, it doesn't have like a lot of peaks and valleys if you're kind of eating foods that are stabilizing, so proteins, fats, plant-based fats, the vegetables, just kind of just a squiggly line that's like not too high, not too low, just kind of like even squiggly across the whole day. And then right at the time that we had that Popeyes thigh and a half, the line shoots up, spikes up, and it becomes red. So it goes into the like extreme caution. Like, this is like out of your parameters. This is like in an area that even after a meal, these glucose levels are not healthy. It landed in that space for just that. Now, fortunately, it did come back quickly. We'd actually gone for a walk after that, and exercise helps to bring glucose levels down. But it was really, really surprising to see just how much that affected it, because I would have easily said, well, all the protein in that, and then the fat, of course, that's in that, it's going to kind of like buffer or blunt or sort of offset the effects of that carbohydrate. Like, I would not have thought that a fried chicken breast or the skin from 1.5 or thigh, the skin from 1.5, I would not have thought that it would have spiked or had that much of an effect. If someone would have said, how much would it affect me? I would have probably said, you know what, one thigh, not a big deal. I looked at the nutrition facts, like on the Popeyes website, and it lists one fried thigh as 7 grams of carbohydrate. There's a lot of breading on that, though. And so I don't know how standardized that is across all. The chicken breast breaded is about 16 grams of carbohydrate, they list. And then a 3-piece of fried chicken tenders is 29 grams of carbohydrate. So I think it kind of depends on like how heavy-handed that breading might be. But yeah, so for me, that was one that I thought, wow, it was really surprising that that one thigh raised it. Is that to say that I'm not going to have it again? No. A lot of people say, y'all know that people in New Orleans, y'all hear a lot of people say like they have fried chicken once a year for Mardi Gras. We probably have it, I'd say probably 4 times a year. It's something that maybe 3, 4, but like it's something that every few months we'll get it, and we have just what I kind of said there. And it was also funny because when the guy asked me at the TV station, do I ever, eat things that aren't healthy? And I said, yeah, like actually yesterday we had fried chicken. Everybody's head swiveled around and they were like, oh, and then they kind of started quoting other people who are kind of in the wellness space. So and so says that he never eats that, or he never eats anything that's not healthy, or so and so says that she never does this, only healthy things. And I thought, huh. So I was like, well, that's not us, mostly we do. And so it's not advocating that these are healthy, that these are healthy things to do, but that's just life. And a lot of times I think that most of us come across, whether it's fried chicken or whatever that might be, that is kind of like your thing. Even if you eat healthy most of the time, there's usually things that are going to come across that you're going to indulge in. And so for me, this wasn't something to say, this is a reason to not eat this, but it was really striking to see how that affected. So it would also sort of reiterate that if I am having something like that fried chicken thigh in the future, to be mindful that, not pairing it or having it with other starchy carbohydrates with that meal. Um, on an interesting note, they also offer blackened chicken tenders at Popeyes. And the blackened tenders are basically still fried. They are as lean as grilled skinless chicken, though, because they're not battered. And so they're fried at such a high temp that the oil doesn't soak into like the muscle meat or the meat of the chicken. And so the blackened tenders are essentially in the same calorie range, total fat range as a grilled skinless chicken tender, even though they're fried. They still have the seasoning, of course, the Popeye seasoning. So they are going to be higher sodium than if you just did like grilled chicken tenders at home. But I say all of that to say that if you're looking for that flavor of Popeyes, those blackened tenders, they're not battered. 3 tenders only has about 2 grams of carb because there's literally just the seasoning on there, and they're not, and again, they don't have that batter. So if you're craving that flavor or that spice of something like that Popeye's chicken, that is definitely a viable option. Or you may do something like what I did. You may say, okay, well, I'm going to get like a drumstick or one thigh, and then I'll get a 3-piece blackened tender. So you may have like one thing that's kind of that little extra that gives you that bit of breading you like, but then you're like really getting that protein and that flavor through the blackened tenders. So just wanted to mention that too. But with that, there's also like essentially no impact when I've had the blackened tenders on those glucose levels. But the thigh, because of that breading, really spiked it up. Let's take a minute to talk about Gooder, our sponsor for this week's episode. So I am thrilled to be able to share this with y'all because Gooder sunglasses are my absolute favorite for workouts, for anything active outdoors. They are incredibly lightweight. They are so comfortable, you'll forget they're even there. And they don't slip at all, even at the peak of our New Orleans heat and humidity. Gooder offers a ton of colors and styles. They've got quietly conservative to festively colorful. They're all 100% polarized and only $25. So if you want to support our show and pick yourself up a pair, Gooder is giving Fueled listeners free shipping on your first order. We'll include the link in the show notes, and you can see a few of my different pairs on social too. You can go to gooder.com/fueled. That's GOODR.com/fueled. Use promo code FUELED for free shipping. And Gooder offers 30-day money-back guarantee, 100% satisfaction. Find the pair that fits your style at gooder.com/fueled, promo code FUELED for free shipping. So we've talked about chocolate. We have talked about beers, granted non-alcoholic beers, and we have talked about fried chicken. So those chocolates, like I said, either a flat line or even help to drop glucose levels. The non-alcoholic beers, the Heineken raised it the most. The others, the Partake and the Surreal, they raised it maybe depending on what else I'm eating with it, or if I had recently exercised or kind of what the other circumstances were, they maybe raised it anywhere from 5 to 15 points in glucose levels. So again, I was surprised that even those really lower calorie beers, a little bit of carb they do have raised it, which is, it's not a bad thing to see your glucose levels go up. It was just surprising to me that they even went up with something that only had like 2 grams of carbs in the drink. So that was having your glucose levels rise moderately after a meal is a very normal thing. So the goal of this is not to not ever have that happen, but it's to see what's really causing that big spike. If your glucose levels are spiking up, are they staying up? And if they're hanging out high up there, that's something we really need to address. Exercise can help bring it down. Also, realizing what foods might be causing it to spike up and hang out high. For me, like I mentioned, it was having some of those carbs right before bedtime. It was hanging out up there. So if I wanted to have those, the better time to do it would be during the day when we're still moving, we're going to be going for an evening walk or whatever that might be. Some of the other things I think are kind of expected. I mean, I mentioned sourdough bread earlier, several different times over the past few weeks of wearing the sensor. I've had really good sourdough bread, just that real crusty, just like the perfect, delicious sourdough bread, either toasted hot with some butter or like dipped in olive oil. And each time, I mean, there's the expected rise in glucose levels, like no surprise there. One that does raise glucose levels really significantly, and depending on the day and depending on what else I've had to eat kind of right around there, might raise it anywhere from 30 to 30 or more points, is fresh pressed vegetable juice. So every evening before dinner, basically, we drink a juice blend. It's a balanced blend, and I highly recommend it. It is beets and all types of greens and turmeric and ginger. And the reason I love it is because it's got all of your greens that you would think of with like a green juice, but it also has the beets and it also has the different spices, like we had said, ginger, turmeric, all that. It's about the equivalent of between like 4 and 5 pounds of produce juiced. But it's far more than I would be able to eat if I was actually eating that. But the natural sugars from the beets and the greens and the vegetables in there, even though I'm having about half of it, about 8 ounces, the natural sugars are raising glucose levels. For me, and sometimes it's raising them, like I said, 30 or more points. A couple of things are good with that though. Number one, it's a trade-off. Like I want to get all those nutrients that I'm drinking of that. And just a byproduct of that is that it's going to have those natural sugars that are in those vegetables. The other thing is that usually we'll have that juice and then go for a walk, and then have dinner, or dinner, then go for a walk. But that helps to bring those levels down. But it is something that, especially if someone was really needing to be specifically mindful, just knowing that even something like that, that is extremely nourishing, extremely wholesome and healthy, those are things that when I look kind of at my day, that's one of the things that consistently spikes it. And again, spikes it sometimes into that red level as high as that fried chicken did, is that fresh pressed juice. So again, not that that's a bad thing at all. And for me, it's rising it up and raising it up, and then it's coming back down into a normal level. And so that's okay, but it's just knowing how these different foods affect us. If probably a better strategy for me would be to put that fresh pressed juice in like right after a hard workout. But the issue is that I don't always have it with me. It's home, it's in our fridge. It's not something that I've always got at the ready. And so a lot of times I may be offsite doing that workout. It's going to be hours before I'm home, and toting something like a jar of beet juice around is like not ideal for a bunch of things and spill factors. So for me, while in theory it would probably be best to put it right after that intense workout, it just works better to have it when we get home. We have that before dinner, kind of like have that first, then have dinner after. That just sort of works with life. The other reason it's probably not ideal is having it later in the evening, again, when you are going to be more sedentary. So ideally, like if you were having something like that you said, like, let's just say that fresh pressed vegetable juice, and you saw that it's raising your glucose levels, you may choose to have that right before your lunch or maybe part of your afternoon snack. And, having that when you are going to be more active during the day, because just that movement, that like even non-purposeful movement that we're not even thinking about, helps to bring our glucose levels back down. So it's all just kind of paying attention to it. So again, for me, when I have something like that balanced juice, I see that spike. typically we'll go for a walk or we may do something else and I can see it come back down. It's not hanging high up there. But that would be another thing to just know, okay, how do these foods affect me? So there's different foods, and I've kind of shared with y'all some that are specifically nutritious and then some that of course we would think aren't. And again, some surprises, some not. And then things like the chocolates or whatever type of food it is that you're interested in just seeing how does it affect it. You'll probably, again, everybody is different. Everyone's going to respond to foods differently, but you would probably notice that your protein-based foods, your fats, plant-based fats, or things like cheese or cottage cheese, you'll probably notice that those things don't really have much of an effect on glucose levels. Vegetables starchy vegetables might be more, and then starchy carbohydrates, the breads, the rice, the pastas, those things are going to be more that they would raise it. So you can kind of get to where you start to see how different things are affecting you. And you may also realize, if I'm having this oatmeal, maybe instead of pairing it with a bunch of fruit and toast, I could do the oatmeal with a couple of eggs or the oatmeal with nuts or a nut butter or something else with it. So you can kind of start to play around with different combinations and just see how does this affect the results that you're seeing there. There's also, so food is a big element there. Sleep can affect our glucose levels and stress. This is somewhere I've also had a few times over the time that I've had this monitor on that there were either very intense conversations or things that maybe I was really nervous giving a presentation. And then later when I scanned the glucose sensor, wow, I would see that there had been a rise and I knew that I hadn't eaten anything in that window. And I would realize, oh, wait, that's when I was standing up in front of that room full of people, or that's when I was doing whatever this is that I had kind of like that adrenaline rush or whatever that might be, the kind of what my body was sensing as like a stressor. And so all of those things really can play a role in our glucose levels. So I've just shared with y'all, I thought the fried chicken thing to me was just like fascinating. And then I had to tell y'all like these different like chocolate examples and being able to see, testing different foods that we love. And it's kind of just a curiosity too, to see. And so I had mentioned that NutriSense had sponsored this podcast last year. They do still have a promo code. It's Fueled, and that is still active. We had checked on that just recently. And so that can get you a discount on NutriSense. And so what that looks like, it's a sensor. You stick it in your arm. They have like a cool little, I'm looking at it right now, but they have a cool little, like, I don't know what it would be called. It's like a protective sticker. It's like a fabric sticker that goes over it. And then there's the app with NutriSense that you download the app and you hold your phone over that sensor, and it'll store up to 8 hours of data. You hold your phone over it and it'll update your data right there. And you can see in real time what's happening with your glucose levels. You can keep your food log, your movement log, activities like when do you wake up? When are you going to sleep? Are you doing any meditation? You can do all of that and make those notes. And so as you're kind of scrolling along that little wiggly line I was talking about, kind of that little EKG looking line, as you scroll, you can kind of run your finger over it and then you're able to see it'll bring up for every point that you've entered what you ate, what you drank, what movement you did, or what you were doing as far as like waking up, going to sleep, or meditation, or any of these other things. So the app is a really high functioning interface that lets you see how what we eat, drink, or other things that we're doing, how you can keep that log. So in real time, you can see how it's coinciding with that change in your glucose levels. Also, NutriSense has one-on-one access to a registered dietitian. And so they connect you specifically with a dietitian who is basically your point person to go to for any questions while you're doing the program with NutriSense. So NutriSense, the sensor that you put into your arm, is a sensor made by Abbott. So Abbott being a pharmaceutical company, they have also the brand that arrives with your NutriSense packet is Freestyle Libre, Libre. So it's Freestyle Libre by Abbott is the brand of the sensor. It arrives in a little, mine's in a yellow box. It arrives. You also have your little NutriSense sticker that goes over it. And so you put that sensor in your arm, and it's like a kind of a little spring, like, to me, it reminds me of like this little spring stamp that's like someone would use like a notary or like on a passport, kind of like that type of a spring release. And it's very quick. It goes into your arm. It's just the slightest prick. You're not really even feeling a strong sensation. It's much less than a finger stick if you were to check your glucose levels. And so that brand, though, that Abbott Freestyle Libre is what NutriSense is using. And then with NutriSense, it's about there's several different package options you can do. You can do monthly recurring with NutriSense. You can do multi-month packages. You can do just 1 month. There's different packages you can do, but roughly, let's say it's about $300 a month. And so that can be a significant price point that can be prohibitive for a lot of people, especially if you're looking at it just to say, I want to test some of these foods. And so, again, the promo code FUELED will get you a discount, and that'll, again, pricing and all of that will vary. So you could go on their website and just kind of poke around and see. But what I wanted to share with y'all is the Abbott Freestyle Libre is also available. You can get this with a prescription you don't have to have diabetes. Your physician can give you the prescription for the Freestyle Libre, and it is guaranteed by Abbott. They say it's guaranteed to not cost you more than $75. And so they have worked it out with pharmacies that anyone with a prescription, even someone without diabetes, can have a prescription for this for 2 sensors, 1 month worth of sensors. So each sensor lasts for 2 weeks, and it would be not more than $75. And so $75 is still, it's still a chunk of money, but it is a lot less than the 300 plus that something like a month of NutriSense would be. So I am going to put the link in the show notes to essentially it's what Abbott has as their prescribing instructions, and prescribing instructions meaning for physicians. So if you're talking to your OB or you're talking to your primary care physician, especially depending on the type of physician, like for example, if it is your OB, they may not normally work in the continuous glucose monitor space. But if you are saying to them, hey, I really want to learn more about how these foods are affecting my glucose levels. And again, if for all of us, myself included, if we don't have type 1 or type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, it is an educational tool that is it's not something that we must have in order to make healthy choices. But it is certainly a tool that we can use to educate ourselves on how our bodies personally are processing certain types of foods and how that's affecting our glucose levels. And so there may be things that you feel like, wow, I feel so run down at this time of the day. And then it can be very validating if you see, wow, my glucose levels went from 110 down into the 50s. Well, no wonder I was feeling like that. Okay, let's back it up. What was I eating before or not eating before that may have led to that plummet? So there's just a lot of things that we can do to educate ourselves by using the continuous glucose monitor. So the Abbott Freestyle Libre, there's several different types. There is they have one that's a Freestyle Libre 3. They have a Freestyle Libre 2, and then they have one that they simply call like a 14-day version. My understanding is that one might be being phased out. So there's the Freestyle Libre 2, Freestyle Libre 3. There are some differences between them. They're both really good options, and they both already connect with your phone. So you'll download the Freestyle Libre app, and it's no extra charge to download it. You'll sync it with the sensor, and you're able to see that same kind of squiggly line that we talked about with NutriSense. The difference is there's not the option that the app interface is not as advanced as NutriSense. And so it doesn't allow you to see kind of to where when you scroll along that line of what your glucose levels are, that you can kind of see and match up as easily. You can still keep your log in there and you can still see your glucose levels. It's just a little bit more like if you were looking at a separate piece of paper and then going back to look at your glucose levels. Like they don't kind of overlay one another to really make it as visually easy to see how one's affecting the other. But you can still, if you're going to be diligent about keeping your food log, you could keep it on pen and paper or you could keep it in the app. And then it is a really useful tool to be able to see how those foods and drinks are affecting glucose levels. So I'd say, that the only things that are kind of the buts is you don't have the one-on-one access to the dietitian through a program like NutriSense. And the app interface is like maybe a little bit more basic. It's not as high tech, but you are still able to see in real time your glucose levels. If it's the Freestyle Libre 3, you don't even have to scan it on the regular basis. It just automatically updates from your sensor to the app. The 2, I believe you do still have to scan it with the 2. So this is just a really good opportunity if you have been wanting to experiment with something, but budget is a factor. This is something that is definitely an option for you. So it is specifically, Abbott is specific that it's for, we can refer to them as like big box pharmacies, but like a Walgreens and CVS specifically have this agreement with Abbott that if you're doing this sensor with a prescription, whether you have diabetes or don't have diabetes, that it would not cost more than $75 for that 1 month's supply, which is 2 sensors. I did reach out to our Ochsner pharmacy, and they also can use an RX script save as kind of the prescription discount card. And it's basically $80 for that 1 month supply. So even though other pharmacies may not have that specific agreement that CVS and Walgreens has, in the case like the Ochsner pharmacy, it's $80 for that 1 month supply versus $75 at like a Walgreens or CVS. So yeah, it's $5, but it's still relatively close range there. So what I would say is I've got the prescribing instructions link that I'll have in there. So if your physician doesn't really do this much or hasn't done this before with this specifically, they'll know, they can see it has kind of all the information that they would need in order to know what to put through. And if you don't go to CVS or Walgreens and you do go to a different pharmacy, ask them. So I just reached out to the pharmacy and said, hey, I actually sent them the sheet that I'll be posting the link to and said, hey, are we honoring this? Are y'all honoring this? What's the deal on pricing? And so they can, before you get it filled, they could let you know how much that's going to be. So I always like, as much as we can educate ourselves, the better. And, learning how foods, how we're fueling our body, how it's truly impacting us, seeing where we have room to optimize things, and if we are feeling less than optimal through the day, is there something that we could change that might leave those glucose levels even more stable and steady? And NutriSense has been something that I've been aware of for the past year and a half or so, and I've been a really big fan of it. And so to know that the sensor alone, this Freestyle Libre sensor alone, is available without all the bells and whistles that NutriSense gives, which I do like those. Again, the dietitian and that app interface are really great. But to have it for, $75 for that 1 month can be maybe open the door for you to give it a try. The last thing I'll say on this is also, it's not something that most people are going to do for months and months at a time. If you get the sensors, a 1 month supply of the sensors, again, 2 sensors because they're 2 weeks each, you're going to have a lot of data, a lot of information that you're able to see and you learn from. And then it's not something that most people, especially people without diabetes, you're not going to need to continue to do it forever, so that 1 month may be a one and done. You use that month strategically, test all these different foods, and then you know what's working. And then if things change in 6 months or a year, maybe you treat yourself and you do that again. So lots that we covered here. I'll include the links to the other 2 episodes where we talked in even more detail about continuous glucose monitors. If you want to know kind of more insight, the ins and outs, and kind of the benefits of experimenting with one of these, to see, it's all about educating ourselves and learning what works for us personally, learn what choices and how nourishing our bodies for us individually. It's really cool that we can take what is, broad reaching nutrition guidance, and then really customize, really tailor it for ourselves individually and so personally. So I hope that this has been entertaining to hear about the fried chicken and chocolates and sourdough breads. I forgot to mention Jazz Fest. We did do Jazz Fest. I wore it throughout that. And I will say that all of our Eat Fit dishes out at Jazz Fest kept that line, that little squiggly line, like centered just kind of right on through. So we have loved having Eat Fit options out at Jazz Fest for exactly that reason, to just sustain energy, helping you feel like your best, your strongest, your most energetic, like while you're out at the fest, at Jazz Fest, French Quarter Fest. And so to actually see that as we're eating all these Eat Fit dishes throughout the days out at Jazz Fest, they, that little squiggly line was like right there in the middle, not any highs, not any lows. So I'll include these links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode. Let me know what you think. If you test one of these out, I want to hear about it always. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com. And you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.